I have sat through 41 induction ceremonies in my long life, and I have hated every single one of them. My mandibles clicked together beneath my breathing veil, a habit my instructors always tried to train out of me and never quite managed. Below the observation gallery, the Grand Convergence Hall spreads out in its usual polished absurdity. Floors of black glass so clean they mirror the ceiling, air scrubbed of every scent except the faint, sterile tang of recycled oxygen. A hall built by people who have never had to worry about a roof caving in on them. A hall for the comfortable. Another delegation is being paraded across the dais below. I don't even bother reading their species designation on the display. I already know the shape of their story before they open their mouths, because it is always the same story. A gentle world. A single moon. Tides mild enough to set a metronome by. A climate so forgiving that agriculture arrived before war did, and war itself, when it finally showed up, was polite about it. Border disputes settled with treaties instead of extinction. They will call it wisdom. I call it the absence of a test. My people, the Kessari, did not have that luxury. We come from Vethrun, a world so tectonically restless that our ancestors built nothing that couldn't be rebuilt within a season, because everything eventually needed to be rebuilt. The ground itself was our first enemy, long before we had words for enemy. We learned to read tremors the way these soft delegations read weather reports. We learned that the sky could turn to acid rain, with less warning than it takes to finish a sentence, and so our language has 43 tenses for describing how quickly something can go wrong. I used to take pride in that. For a long time, the Kessari were feared across 3 sectors. Not loved, never loved, but respected in the particular way that only fear can produce. Doors opened for us. Voices lowered when we entered a room. It was a currency, and we spent it freely. That currency has been losing value for decades now. The galaxy has grown tired of being afraid of us. These days they see the plating along our thoraxes and the serrated forelimbs we still carry from a hunting heritage we've never fully shed, and they file us under brutish, capable of violence, incapable of nuance. They forget that a species does not survive a world like Vethrun through brute strength alone. Strength gets you killed on a planet that punishes carelessness. Survival requires calculation, patience, and almost obsessive attention to pattern. The same instincts that let my ancestors track a storm 3 days before it broke, now let me track a trade negotiation 12 moves before its conclusion. But nuance is hard to see in a creature with claws, so nobody bothers looking for it. I am here today because my broodmother commanded it. Attend the convergence, she said in that flat tone she uses when she already expects to be unimpressed. Watch the new arrivals. Tell me if any of them are worth our attention. She did not come herself. She never does. These ceremonies bore her the way they bore me, except she has the rank to delegate the boredom to someone else, and I do not. So here I stand, second clutch heir to a broodmother who has better things to do, watching soft-bodied delegation after soft-bodied delegation cross a floor none of them have ever had to fight for. The current speakers are droning about atmospheric composition. I let my attention drift toward the lower balconies, toward the trade attaché from the Ofen cluster, toward anything that might actually matter by the end of the cycle. There is a weapons demonstration scheduled for next week that concerns me more than this parade of the unremarkable ever could. Then the display above the dais flickers, and the herald's voice changes register. Just slightly. Just enough that I notice, because noticing small changes is the only reason my ancestors are still alive to have descendants. Representatives of the newly contacted species Terra. I don't recognize the name. That alone is unusual. I have made it my business to know every species under discussion for admission, if only so I can report to my broodmother with the appearance of competence. This one slipped past me entirely. I turned my attention back to the dais, expecting the usual parade. Soft skin, wide eyes, a nervous handler explaining that their species has only recently achieved unified planetary governance and hasn't yet worked out interstellar etiquette. I brace for another hour of my time evaporating into nothing. The delegation steps forward, bipedal, unarmored, skin in a scattering of pale and brown tones, no visible natural weaponry, no claws, No plating. Nothing that would suggest anything other than a species that evolution decided to leave defenseless. My interest, what little of it had been engaged, begins to fade again. Then I notice the way the lead delegate walks. It's subtle. Most observers wouldn't catch it, wouldn't even think to look. But my people learned to read gait patterns the way others read facial expressions, because on Vethrin, the way something moved told you whether it was hunting, fleeing, or dying, and getting that assessment wrong killed you. This human, because that is apparently what they call themselves, an unlovely word, blunt and short, walks with a very particular kind of tension in the lower limbs. A slight overcompensation in the stride, weight distributed as though the body expects the floor to shift beneath it, and has already, unconsciously, prepared a countermeasure. I know that gait. I have that gait on worlds with lighter gravity than my own, where my body keeps flinching in anticipation of forces that never come. I lean forward against the gallery rail, my forelimbs scraping audibly against the stone. Beside me, the Ofen attaché, a translucent, many-eyed creature named Vess, who found this species during a routine survey mission 3 cycles ago, glances over with an expression I have learned to associate with barely restrained satisfaction. "You noticed," Vess says. Her vocal apparatus produces a wet clicking sound that passes for amusement among her kind. "Noticed what?" I ask, though I already suspect I know. "The walk." She turns back toward the dais. "Everyone else in this chamber sees soft skin and no claws and stops looking. You didn't stop looking." I say nothing. I am not in the habit of confirming observations to delegates from other species, even ones who found something worth finding. But I do not look away from the human delegation either. The lead delegate reaches the podium. A translated designation appears beneath her image on the display. Dr. Amara Okonkwo Reyes, representing the Unified Terran Assembly. She is smaller than I expected, though I am not certain what I expected. Her expression, as she surveys the chamber, is not the nervous deference I've come to anticipate from newly contacted species standing before a room full of beings who could, with minimal effort, erase her entire civilization. It is something closer to careful, deliberate calm, the calm of someone who has rehearsed not showing fear rather than someone who does not feel it. "Representatives of the Convergence," she begins, and her voice carries an evenness that strikes me immediately, because I have heard that particular evenness before, in the voice of Kessari commanders addressing troops before a descent into a collapse zone. It is the voice of someone managing their own fear through sheer procedural discipline. "On behalf of the peoples of Earth, thank you for this opportunity." Peoples. Plural. I file that away. "I understand," she continues, "that these proceedings typically include a presentation of our homeworld's history and character. I have one prepared. I should warn you in advance that it may not follow the format you're accustomed to." A ripple of polite confusion moves through the gallery below. The soft species always follow the format. The format exists precisely because it flatters everyone involved. A tour through pleasant geography, a note about cooperative governance, a promise of valuable trade goods. Nobody deviates from the format, because the format is designed to get you admitted without incident. Dr. Okonkwo Reyes activates the display. A planet resolves above the dais, and for a moment it looks exactly like every other homeworld presentation I've sat through, a marbled sphere of blue and green, aesthetically engineered to inspire the kind of reflexive awe that soft-bodied delegates weep openly over. I feel my attention start to drift again, already anticipating the standard script. Then the image begins to zoom, and the standard script does not arrive. 71% of Earth's surface is ocean, she says. 96% of that water is undrinkable to us without processing, too saline, too far from shore, too deep for our bodies to survive the pressure. For the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, we had no way to process it. We fought for the remaining fraction the same way every other resource has ever been fought for on our world, relentlessly and without guarantee of success. The image shifts. I watch continents rotate into view and something tightens in my thorax as the geography resolves into focus. Not gentle rolling plains, not temperate coastlines, but a violent patchwork of extremity. Deserts, where the display's temperature overlay climbs high enough that I briefly assume it's a translation error. Ice fields where the same overlay plunges low enough to shatter most polymer compounds. Dense equatorial growth so thick with competing organisms that the display can't render individual specimens without the image dissolving into visual noise. It looks like Vethran wearing a different face. Our species did not domesticate this world, Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes says. We survived it, piece by piece, region by region, for roughly 300,000 years before agriculture gave us anything resembling stability. By the time we developed writing, we had already established permanent settlement on every habitable continent, using nothing but the tools we could carry and the knowledge we could pass down before dying young enough that most of us didn't get the chance to grow old. I straighten involuntarily. Beside me, Vess makes her wet clicking sound again, softer this time, almost to herself. I told you, she murmurs. The chamber's ambient murmur has died into something closer to silence. Around the gallery, I can see other delegates beginning to lean forward. The same reflexive attention I felt, the recognition of something that doesn't fit the expected pattern. I anticipate, the human continues, and there is the faintest edge in her voice now, something dry and deliberate. That several of you are already updating your threat assessments to classify us as a hardy species from a hostile environment. That assessment is correct, but it is incomplete. Our environment is not what defines us. It is merely what we grew up arguing with. The display shifts again. I expect predator footage, some large native beast, teeth and claws, the kind of imagery my own species would have led with, because that is the currency we understand. Show them what nearly killed you. Let the fear of that thing transfer onto you by association. Instead, the image shows humans. Just humans, dressed in crude coverings carrying long wooden implements, moving in a loose formation across an open grassland at what I initially assume must be a jog, until the counter overlay in the corner of the display begins ticking upward. 1 hour, 4 hours, 9 hours. And I realize with a slow creeping understanding that they are not jogging. They are running. Continuously. Behind them, barely visible in the heat shimmer of the display, a herd of massive quadrupedal animals flees at a much faster initial pace before beginning, gradually, to falter. Early humans lacked the natural weaponry to kill most of the large game on our world through direct confrontation, Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes explains. We are not particularly fast. We are not particularly strong, relative to our size. What we discovered, tens of thousands of years before we had a word for physiology, was that almost nothing on Earth could out-endure us. We could regulate our body heat efficiently enough across long enough distances to run prey animals into exhaustion and collapse, sometimes over the course of a full day. We killed some of the largest, most dangerous animals on our planet not through strength, but through simple, absolute refusal to stop. The counter in the display ticks past 11 hours. The herd, what remains visible of it, has slowed to a stagger. The humans have not. I find my claws have curled tight around the gallery railing, deep enough that I can feel the stone beginning to give slightly beneath the pressure. I do not loosen my grip. This pattern repeats throughout our history, she continues, and the display accelerates, images flickering past faster now. Crude settlements growing into cities, cities scarring into fortified structures, weapons evolving from sharpened stone to something that leaves smoke trailing across the display in long dark lines. We are, by most physical measures available to xenobiologists who've studied our specimens remotely, an unremarkable species, moderate strength, moderate speed. No claws, no natural armor, no venom, no specialized sensory organs beyond baseline. What we have is stamina, adaptability, and an apparently limitless willingness to keep going long after every rational calculation suggests we should stop. A new image resolves, a chart stark and unadorned, plotting something across a timeline that spans what the display labels as several thousand of Earth's own years. I don't need the translated axis labels to understand what I'm looking at. I have seen enough Vethran conflict data in my life to recognize a casualty graph when one is placed in front of me. Over the course of our recorded history, Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes says, and her voice does not waver, does not apologize, does not perform the shame I half expect from a species presenting this kind of data to a room full of potential allies. Conservative estimates place the number of humans killed by other humans, in organized conflict alone, at well over 100 million. That figure does not include lower intensity violence, structural harm, or the substantial portion of our history that predates reliable record-keeping. We suspect the true number is considerably higher. The gallery has gone entirely silent now. I glance sideways and see the Ofen trade attaché beside Vess visibly recoil, her many eyes contracting in what I recognize, across species, as something close to horror. Good. Let her be horrified. I am not horrified. I am something else entirely. Something with no clean translation in the trade common dialect. A feeling that sits in the space between recognition and vindication. I want to be clear about something, Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes says. And now she looks directly up into the gallery, not at any specific delegate, but at all of us collectively. A sweep of her gaze across the assembled representatives of a dozen species who have never had to fight this hard for anything. We are not proud of this number. Many of us spend considerable effort trying to understand why our species is capable of both remarkable cooperation and this scale of internal violence simultaneously. But I am not here to apologize for what we are. I'm here to tell you honestly what we are. Because I believe every species in this chamber deserves an accurate account before deciding what kind of neighbor we might become. She pauses. The silence stretches. We are not a gentle species that stumbled into technology, she says. We are a species that has spent its entire existence at war with our environment, with each other, and, more often than either of us would like to admit, with ourselves. We are still here. That is, as far as I am able to determine, the only claim we are actually entitled to make. The presentation shifts one final time, cycling briefly through images that feel almost like an afterthought after what preceded them. Human art, human music notation scrolling across the display in intricate patterns, structures built, not for war, but for reasons the translation labels only as communal significance. Children, I assume they are children based on relative size, laughing in some open space under a yellow sun, not unlike the one that hangs over the Convergence Hall's own simulated sky. It is a strange coda, beauty appended to horror, offered without any attempt to make the horror smaller. That concludes our formal presentation, Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes says. I am available for questions, though I suspect most of you will have more of them than our allotted time permits. The lights rise. Nobody speaks for a long moment. I am the first to move, though I do not fully register the decision to do so until I am already on my feet. Around me, the other delegates in the gallery shift uncomfortably, several of them drawing back as though my standing alone constitutes some kind of threat display, which I suppose to their eyes it does. A Kessari rising to full height, forelimbs still gripping the railing, plating catching the chamber's ambient light. They read it as aggression, because aggression is the only frame they have for a Kessari doing anything with conviction. They are wrong, but I let them be wrong. Their misunderstanding is not my responsibility to correct. Vess glances up at me, her earlier satisfaction now edged with something more careful. Well? She asks. Was I right? I don't answer her immediately. I am still watching Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes on the dais below, still processing the shape of what I've just witnessed. Every other species that has ever stood on that platform has led with their strength and hidden their scars, or led with their peace and hidden nothing because there was nothing to hide. This human did neither. She led with the worst thing about her species and dared the entire chamber to hold it against her anyway. That is not a diplomat's instinct. That is a warrior's instinct dressed in a diplomat's clothing. You were right, I tell Vess, and I mean it more completely than I have meant anything in a long time. This one is different. The formal proceedings conclude with the usual bureaucratic momentum. Provisional admission granted pending committee review. Trade delegation assignments distributed. The standard machinery of the Convergence grinding forward regardless of what has just happened in this room. I barely register any of it. My attention keeps returning to the human delegation as they gather their materials, to Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes specifically, to the way she moves through the dispersing crowd of delegates with the same careful, deliberate control she showed at the podium. I make my way down from the gallery with a speed that draws glances from the delegates I pass. Let them stare. I have spent decades cultivating a reputation as an ambitious, faintly dangerous second-clutch heir with limited patience for ceremony, and today that reputation is finally working in my favor rather than against it, because nobody questions a Kessari moving with purpose. They simply get out of the way. I find the human delegation clustered near a refreshment station in the outer concourse, a space designed for exactly this kind of post-ceremony mingling, though most delegations use it to network with species they already understand. Dr. Okonkwo Reyes stands slightly apart from her aides, holding a small plate of unfamiliar food with the careful posture of someone who has been trained not to eat in public settings where cameras or observers might be present, but who also clearly hasn't eaten in some time. She sees me approaching before I'm halfway across the concourse. I watch her track the movement, watch her aides shift subtly to flank her, watch her make a small gesture that stops them before they can fully close ranks. She has been briefed on my species, I realize. She knows what a Kessari at full height, moving with purpose, might represent to someone who hasn't done the reading. She has done the reading. I stop before her, and the height difference between us is considerable. I stand nearly twice her measure, my plated shoulders casting a shadow across the refreshment table. Every advantage in this exchange belongs to me, physically. She holds a plate of food and does not step back. Delegate Okonkwo Reyes, I say, using the trade common dialect rather than my native tongue, a courtesy I extend to almost no one outside my own species. I am Kessari Threll, second clutch of broodmother Vantha. I would speak with you if your schedule permits. She sets the plate down with deliberate care, not haste. It permits, she says. Though I'll admit I wasn't expecting to be sought out quite this quickly. Most delegations wait for the formal introduction period. I am not most delegations. I let that sit for a moment, watching her expression, looking for the flicker of calculation I expect. Is this a threat? Is this an opportunity? How do I navigate this exchange without giving away more than I intend to? I find it, but I also find something underneath it that I did not expect. Genuine curiosity, unclouded by performance. Your presentation, I continue, was not what I anticipated. I gathered that from the way half the gallery looked like they wanted to file a formal complaint. A faint, dry humor colors her voice. Not nervous laughter, but something closer to genuine wit deployed under pressure, a trait I have rarely encountered outside my own kind. For what it's worth, that wasn't the reaction we were hoping for. We debated for months whether to lead with the honest version or the comfortable version. Why the honest version? She considers the question with more weight than I expected a diplomat to give it. Because the comfortable version doesn't survive first contact with reality, she says finally. Sooner or later, someone in this convergence was going to run a deep background check on us, and they were going to find the wars and the numbers and all of it. And if we'd spent our first appearance pretending that history didn't exist, the eventual discovery would have looked like deception. We decided it was better to control the narrative ourselves, even if it cost us some initial goodwill. I study her for a long moment. It is, I realize, precisely the calculation I would have made in her position. Not the instinct of a diplomat trained to minimize friction, but the instinct of someone trained to assess long-term risk and accept short-term damage in exchange for durability. You were a soldier, I say. It is not a question. Something flickers across her face. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, as though she has just confirmed something about me in turn. 14 years, she says. Field medic, then command, before I transitioned into diplomatic service. Most people don't clock that from a 5-minute conversation. Most people are not Kessari. I allow a fraction of amusement into my voice, an unfamiliar sensation after so many decades of practiced detachment. We are taught to read the way a body carries its history. Yours carries quite a lot. So does yours, she says, and there's no deference in the observation, no attempt to soften it into flattery. It is simply an assessment, offered plainly, the way one professional might offer an assessment to another. You didn't grow up somewhere gentle either. Vethrin does not permit gentleness, I say. The ground itself tries to kill you with some regularity. We learned early that survival required more than strength. It required... I search for the correct translation, finding the trade common dialect briefly inadequate to the concept. Pattern discipline. The ability to anticipate catastrophe before it announces itself. That sounds exhausting. It is exhausting, I agree. It is also the only reason my species still exists to have this conversation. She studies me for a moment, and I find myself doing something I have not done with another delegate in longer than I care to calculate. I hold still and allow myself to be studied in return, without posturing, without the defensive display that has become second nature in rooms full of soft-bodied diplomats who fear what they don't understand. Would you be interested, I ask before I fully decided to ask it, in continuing this conversation somewhere with fewer observers? The lower concourse level has establishments better suited to a genuine exchange than this. I gesture at the refreshment table, at the hovering aids, at the polished sterility of the upper concourse. Performance. She glances at her aides, who have the carefully neutral expressions of people trained not to react visibly to their superior making unexpected decisions. Give me a moment, she says, and steps aside to speak with them briefly, low enough that I don't attempt to listen, though I could. When she returns, there's a settled quality to her expression, the look of someone who has weighed a risk and decided it is acceptable. Lead the way, she says. Though I should warn you, if this is an elaborate assassination attempt, my people will be extremely disappointed in my judgment. If I intended to kill you, I say, I would not require privacy to accomplish it. You would already be dead, and I would be explaining the incident to a tribunal instead of buying you a drink. She laughs, an actual laugh, short and genuine, not the careful diplomatic chuckle I've heard from 100 delegates performing amusement they don't feel. Well, she says, when you put it that way, I feel much safer. The lower concourse is where species who actually want to talk to each other tend to gather, away from the Convergence Hall's manufactured sterility. The air here carries actual scent, fermented drinks from a dozen different biochemistries, something roasting that I can't identify but that smells distantly appealing. The low murmur of conversation in a dozen untranslated dialects. I choose a table in a corner booth, away from the main thoroughfare, and signal for 2 servings of something my own species drinks to mark occasions worth remembering. Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes settles across from me with the alert, unhurried posture of someone who has learned to relax without ever fully lowering their guard. Another trait I recognize immediately, because I share it. So, she says, once the drinks arrive and she's taken a cautious first sip, immediately suppressing a cough at whatever the liquor does to a human throat. Kessari Threll. Second clutch heir. That means you have siblings ahead of you in succession, I assume. 3, I confirm. All older, all considerably more invested in the succession than I am. You don't want the position? I have watched what the position does to those who hold it, I say. My broodmother was, before she ascended, someone I might have respected. Now she is someone I obey. The distinction matters more than most outsiders realize. I turn the cup in my forelimb, watching the liquid catch the low light. I would rather be useful than powerful. The two are not always compatible. I understand that more than you'd expect, she says. I turned down a promotion twice before I finally accepted the diplomatic reassignment. Command isn't the same as leadership in my experience. Command mostly means being the person other people are allowed to blame when things go wrong. That has not been my experience of command, I say, though perhaps only because I have avoided it successfully so far. She smiles at that, and for a moment, the careful diplomatic control slips into something more unguarded. Tired, perhaps, or simply relieved to be speaking without an audience. Can I ask you something? She says. Honestly, and you can tell me if it's inappropriate. Ask. Back in the hall, when I got to the casualty numbers, most of the room looked like they wanted to leave. You looked like... She pauses, searching for the word. Vindicated. Why? I consider the question longer than it probably deserves, turning it over the way I would turn over a difficult trade negotiation, looking for the honest answer rather than the convenient one. Because every other species that has stood in that hall, I say finally, has offered the Convergence a story engineered to be comfortable. Peaceful histories, gentle worlds, violence minimized or omitted entirely, as though the absence of conflict is the only thing worth being proud of. And for decades my people have stood apart from that pattern and been punished for it, not because we are more violent than the numbers your species just displayed, but because we never learned to hide our violence behind a curated narrative. We simply are what we are, openly. And the galaxy decided that honesty was the same thing as savagery. I take a slow drink before continuing. Today, for the first time in my life, I watched another species choose honesty over comfort, in front of the entire convergence, at genuine cost to themselves. You did not minimize your history to be liked. You presented it accurately and dared the room to respect you anyway. I meet her eyes. An unfamiliar gesture across our biology, but one I have learned carries weight with her species. That is not weakness. That is the same discipline that let my ancestors survive Vethran. I recognized it the moment your delegate began speaking, and I have not stopped recognizing it since. She is quiet for a moment, turning her own cup slowly. The same gesture I made a moment ago, though I doubt she noticed she was mirroring me. For what it's worth, she says eventually, we almost didn't do it that way. There was a whole faction back home arguing for exactly the sanitized version you just described. Lead with the good, bury the bad in a footnote. Hope nobody looks too closely until we've already secured favorable trade terms. She shakes her head slightly. I argued against it, told them that any alliance built on a lie has an expiration date, and I'd rather know now whether anyone in this convergence is willing to accept us honestly, before we've built something worth losing. A soldier's calculation, I say, not a diplomat's. Story of my career, she says with the dry humor returning. Tell me about the succession wars, if you're willing. I read the summary files before this trip, but summary files never tell you anything that actually matters. So I tell her. I tell her about the Ascension trials, about the 3 brood cycles before mine that ended in formal combat between siblings, because Vethran's ancient laws still require the strongest claim to be proven rather than simply declared. I tell her about my second sibling Korash, who nearly died proving his claim against our eldest, and has carried the injury ever since, a permanent limp that our society reads as a badge of legitimacy rather than a wound. I tell her about the Great Reclamation 3 centuries past, when the Kessari finally stopped fighting the planet piecemeal and instead undertook a coordinated generational engineering project to stabilize enough of Vethran's crust to allow permanent cities. A war against geology itself, fought with the same tactical doctrine we'd once used against each other. She listens without the performative sympathy I've learned to expect from soft-bodied delegates, without the flinching horror the Ofen attaché displayed during the presentation. She listens the way one survivor listens to another, recognizing the shape of hardship without needing it explained, occasionally offering a parallel from her own species' history that lands with unsettling precision. In turn, she tells me about wars I have only seen summarized in intelligence briefings, vast mechanized conflicts that consumed continents, fought over ideologies rather than resources, over questions of governance and belief that seem, from the outside, almost abstract compared to the concrete brutality of Vethran's environment, and yet produced casualty numbers that dwarf anything my own species' succession conflicts have managed. She tells me about a period her species calls the Cold War, an extended standoff between 2 factions that never directly fought each other but instead threatened mutual annihilation for the better part of a century through weapons capable of ending their entire civilization in hours, a doctrine so calculated, so patient, so thoroughly premised on controlled restraint rather than reckless aggression, that I find myself reassessing everything I thought I understood about this species in the space of a single explanation. You built weapons capable of destroying your own world, I say slowly, and then spent 100 years deliberately not using them, purely through mutual calculation. More or less, she says. It's not something we're proud of exactly. But it is, I think, the clearest example of what makes us dangerous in a way that isn't really about strength. We're capable of extraordinary restraint when the stakes are catastrophic enough. We're just not always capable of it at smaller scales, which is arguably worse. On Vethran, I say, restraint of that kind would be considered a virtue few species could claim. To hold that much destructive capacity and choose repeatedly not to use it, that is not softness. That is control most predators never develop, because most predators are never tested with a weapon large enough to require it. She looks at me for a long moment, something working behind her eyes that I can't fully read. Her species' expressions are subtler than my own, harder to parse without years of dedicated study, but I recognize the shape of it regardless. Recognition. The same recognition I offered her at the podium now returned. You know, she says, most of the delegates I've spoken to today have either been afraid of us or fascinated by us like we're a specimen in a display case. You're the first one who's talked to me like we're the same kind of thing. We may be, I say. Different worlds, different biology. But I do not think the difference between us and the difference between either of us and the rest of this convergence are the same difference. She raises her cup slightly, a gesture I've come to understand over the course of this conversation as a kind of toast. To surviving the worlds that tried to kill us, she says. I raise mine in return, an approximation of the same gesture, adapted to my own physiology. To surviving each other when the worlds weren't enough of a test. We drink. Around us, the lower concourse continues its low murmur of a dozen species conducting a dozen unrelated conversations, none of them aware that something has just shifted quietly at this corner table. Not an alliance exactly, not yet, but the first honest recognition between two species that have spent their existence being underestimated by everyone comfortable enough never to have needed the same discipline. She turns the empty cup once more between her fingers before setting it down and signaling, unprompted, for a second round of her own. I note the gesture with something like approval. Most delegates from soft worlds ration themselves carefully around unfamiliar species, wary of losing composure in front of something that might exploit the lapse. She has apparently decided the risk is acceptable, which tells me more about her assessment of me than anything she could have said aloud. Can I ask you something else? She says once the second round arrives. Something less diplomatic. You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer. Fair enough. She studies the surface of her drink for a moment before continuing. Back in the hall, before the ceremony started, I watched the gallery on the feed from backstage while we were waiting to go on. I saw you before I ever met you. You looked like you wanted to be anywhere else in the galaxy. I did. So what changed? Because by the time we finished the presentation, you weren't looking at us like a bored observer anymore. I consider how much of the answer I am willing to give her, and find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I am willing to give her most of it. On Vethran, I say, there is an old accounting we use to measure another creature's worth before deciding whether to trust it near your brood. We do not ask whether it is strong. Strength is common and cheap. We ask whether it has been tested, and whether it tells the truth about what the test cost it. Every delegation I have watched cross that dais for decades has been strong, in whatever fashion their biology permits, and every one of them has lied about the cost. Your species was the first in longer than I can calculate to tell the truth about the cost first, before anyone forced you to. That's a very specific cultural metric to apply to a first contact ceremony. It is the only metric I have ever found useful, I say. The rest is performance, and I have grown tired of performance. She is quiet for a moment, and when she speaks again, her voice has lost some of its careful diplomatic polish, settling into something more unguarded. Where I grew up, she says, there's an old saying, something like, you don't really know a person until you've seen what they do when they're exhausted, frightened, and have nothing left to prove. Everything before that is just a rehearsal. That is a good saying. I may borrow it. Borrow freely, it's not copyrighted. A faint smile. For what it's worth, I wasn't sure the honest presentation would land the way it did. I spent most of the flight here rehearsing contingencies for it going badly. Contingencies for outright hostility. contingencies for the whole delegation being escorted out before the numbers even finished displaying. What was your contingency for a Kessari heir approaching your delegation within minutes of the ceremony's conclusion? Honestly? She laughs, short and genuine. I didn't have one. That wasn't in any of the briefing materials. Then we are even, I say. I did not have a contingency for finding a species worth speaking to honestly in this convergence. I had resigned myself decades ago to sitting through ceremonies and reporting back nothing of consequence. Your broodmother sounds like she'd be disappointed to hear that description of your usual reports. My broodmother has long since stopped expecting anything of consequence from these ceremonies either, I say, which is precisely why she stopped attending them herself and began sending me instead. I suspect today's report will surprise her more than anything I have delivered in several cycles. Dr. Okonkwo Reyes leans back slightly, studying me with the same careful, appraising attention she gave me across the podium, before the drinks, before any of this. What are you going to tell her? I consider the question seriously because it deserves serious consideration. That the Terran delegation should not be filed under the category we usually reserve for newly admitted species, I say. That your species has survived a test most of this convergence has never faced, and that the restraint you demonstrated in admitting to your own capacity for violence, without either minimizing it or performing shame over it, is a form of discipline my own people would recognize as kinship if they were willing to look past the absence of claws. That's a generous assessment for one conversation and 2 drinks. It is an accurate assessment, I say. Generosity has very little to do with it. I do not extend trust easily, and I have extended more of it in this conversation than I have to any delegate from any species in longer than I care to calculate. That is not generosity. That is recognition. She doesn't answer immediately. Instead, she looks past me toward the concourse's high, transparent ceiling, where the slow wheel of unfamiliar stars is beginning to show through the station's simulated dusk. You know what's strange, she says eventually. Back home, most people who hear about this trip assume the hardest part will be convincing an alien delegation that we're not a threat. Nobody prepared me for the opposite problem, trying to convince someone that we're exactly as dangerous as we say we are, without that being the thing that ends the conversation. On Vethran, I say, a creature that tells you honestly how dangerous it is has already done you a kindness. The dangerous ones who lie about it are the ones worth fearing. I'll pass that along to the committee. Might make the next briefing easier to write. She takes another sip, more relaxed now than she was at the start of the second round. Tell me something else. Off the record, whatever passes for off the record in a place like this. Do you think this convergence is ready for a species like mine? Honestly, I weigh the question the way I would weigh a genuine tactical assessment, not a diplomatic courtesy. No, I say. I do not think this convergence is ready for a species like yours, any more than it was ever fully ready for a species like mine. It has spent generations rewarding comfort and mistaking gentleness for virtue, and it will not know what to do with a species that survived through relentless adaptability and honest self-assessment rather than the absence of hardship. It will try to categorize you the way it has tried to categorize the Kessari, as brutish, as a threat to be managed rather than appear to be understood. That is not a flaw in your species. It is a flaw in this convergence's imagination. That's either the most reassuring or the most alarming thing anyone said to me all day. Perhaps both, I say. The two are not mutually exclusive in my experience. She laughs again, and this time it carries less careful restraint than before. Something closer to genuine relief. The sound of someone who has spent an entire day performing composure, finally allowing a fraction of the pressure to release. I think, she says, I'm going to enjoy having you as a colleague, Threll. Assuming the committee doesn't find a way to bury this partnership in procedural delay before it goes anywhere. They may try, I say. I would advise them against it. My broodmother does not appreciate having her interests obstructed by procedural delay, and I intend to make certain she understands precisely how much interest she now has in this outcome. Remind me not to get on your broodmother's bad side. Everyone's side is her bad side, I say. It is simply a question of degree. We sit with that for a moment. The easy quiet of two people who have said the important things and no longer feel obligated to fill every silence with further words. Another trait I note that this species and mine apparently share, however different the biology that produced it. Around us, the lower concourse has grown busier as the station's simulated evening progresses, other delegations drifting in for their own quieter conversations away from the Convergence Hall's formal machinery, none of them paying particular attention to a Kessari air and a human diplomat sharing a corner booth. There will be a formal delegation exchange proposal, I tell her. Trade committees, cultural liaisons, the usual bureaucratic machinery. I intend to be involved in shaping it personally, which is not something I typically volunteer for. I'll make sure our side takes the offer seriously, she says, assuming my superiors don't find some reason to overrule me, which, given today's presentation, is a genuine possibility. If they overrule you, I say, you may inform them that the Kessari heir apparent finds the Terran delegate considerably more credible than whatever sanitized alternative your committee originally proposed. It will not carry official weight, but it may carry unofficial weight, which is often more useful. She smiles again, and this time there's no careful diplomatic calculation behind it. Just something simpler, something closer to genuine warmth extended towards someone she has decided, over the course of one drink and one difficult conversation, is worth extending it to. I think, she says, this is the start of something the rest of this convergence is not remotely prepared for. Good, I say, and mean it more thoroughly than I have meant almost anything in the years since my broodmother first began sending me to sit through ceremonies I despised, watching species after species offer the galaxy a comfortable lie. Let them be unprepared. The comfortable ones usually are. Above us, several levels up, the Grand Convergence Hall is already emptying, delegates dispersing back toward their ships and their gentle homeworlds, already composing the reports they'll send back, explaining what they witnessed today. A species that broke the format, that refused the comfortable story, that stood in front of the galaxy's assembled powers and admitted, without flinching, to being exactly as dangerous and exactly as capable of restraint as the numbers suggested. They will not understand what they saw. Most of them never do. But I understand, and for the first time in longer than I can easily calculate, so does someone else in this galaxy. Someone who grew up learning the same lessons I did, on a world that offered no comfort and demanded, in exchange for survival, precisely the kind of discipline that this convergence has never learned to recognize as anything other than savagery. Let them keep failing to recognize it. Threll and Okonkwo Reyes know better now. That, I suspect, will turn out to matter considerably more than anything decided in the formal proceedings today. We order a second round, and the conversation continues long after the concourse lights begin their gradual cycle toward the station's simulated night. Two survivors from two different corners of a galaxy that never expected either of them, finding in each other something neither expected to find at all. A colleague who does not require translation, in the language that matters most. Thanks for listening. If this one hit different, let me know what you thought in the comments and tell me which species you'd want to see Earth cross paths with next.